Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started. Welcome to our Religious Freedom Forum. I'm Ellie Hayland. I am president of HumanistsMN. We are thrilled to have you all here today for this very special event. So I thank you for emerging from your blankets and your warm homes to come out here today. And I'd like to extend a special welcome to our virtual guests. I believe there are quite a few of them here today, so thank you for tuning in. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with humanism or HumanistsMN, I have a brief crash course. We are a secular community for ethical living, committed to the well-being of all and sustainability of the planet, and a home for those looking for a community of naturally curious, compassionate, and rational people. In short, we believe you can be good without a God. We were inspired to put together this forum to acknowledge National Religious Freedom Day. This day has been observed by U.S. presidents since 1993. It commemorates the adoption of Thomas Jefferson's landmark Virginia Statute for religious freedom on January 16, 1786. The statute became the basis for the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, guaranteeing the separation of church and state. This year, HumanistsMN has chosen to commemorate this day given the growing threat of religious nationalism in our country. We recognize the importance of keeping government and religion separate to protect Americans of all faiths or no faith to practice their beliefs. While HumanistsMN is a secular organization, we are not anti-religion. We're all here today, both religious and non-religious, people of goodwill and conscience who believe in the well-being of all and who support the separation of religion and government. We see you all as allies, and we are so glad that you're here. A bit of housekeeping. I wanted to share a rundown of the program. First, Rachel Lazar will speak. We'll then have the first panel, a short break, the second panel, and then the Q&A. For those here in person, I encourage you to fill out the note cards that you received with any questions you might have. And then if you just raise your hand, someone will come by to collect it for the Q&A portion. For our virtual guests, you can submit your questions in the comment section online, and we'll be monitoring that. And after the program, we will have a reception downstairs. Restrooms are out in the hall and to the left, or downstairs and also to the left. And a disclaimer that there will be photos and videos taken today that may be used for promotional or marketing purposes in the future. And lastly, we encourage you to make a donation during the reception to help us cover the costs of this event. Up next, I'd like to introduce Suzanne Perry. She is a board member, marketing co-chair, our newsletter editor. Needless to say, she is an invaluable member of HumanistsMN. So she's also the brains behind this event. So please welcome Suzanne.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm pleased that I'm going to be able to introduce our keynote speaker and moderator today. But a little background first. Some of you in the audience know that for roughly the past 5 years, HumanistsMN has sponsored a big event at the state capitol every May to observe the National Day of Reason. We invite legislators and advocates to gather for breakfast and stand up for the constitutional principle of separation of religion and government. These were successful events, but we decided to try something different this year. We thought, why not do something at the beginning of the legislative session rather than at the end, to set the tone for our advocacy during the session? And why not do something on a weekend so more people could attend? Thus, today's event was born. National Religious Freedom Day takes place in January, so it was a perfect peg. We decided to plan an event where we could explore the true meaning of religious freedom. That is a principle that protects the rights of all of us, whatever our faith or whether we have no faith at all, to practice our beliefs. We've been alarmed by a growing trend of justifying harmful behavior in the name of religious freedom, denying basic human dignity to trans people, restricting abortion and contraceptives, imposing book bans, injecting religion into schools. Let's plan an event, we thought, to set the record straight. This became even more critical after Donald Trump was elected. Then we had to think about bringing in a speaker. Well, we didn't have to think very long. Rachel Lazar is president and CEO of Americans United for Separation of Church and State, an organization that is at the forefront of the fight against Christian nationalism and discrimination in the name of religion. I heard Rachel speak last spring at Americans United Summit for Religious Freedom in Washington, and I was impressed by the way she illustrated that church-state separation is not just some fusty legal principle, it's something that affects all of us in our daily lives. Rachel became president of Americans United in February 2018. A lawyer who was raised as a Reformed Jew, she is the organization's first non-Christian and female leader in its 76-year history. Before joining AU, Rachel worked as an educator on white privilege and racism and held positions with the Religious Action Center of Reformed Judaism, Third Way, and the National Women's Law Center. Please welcome Rachel Lazar.
What a great crowd. It's great to be with you all. Would have you come if it was Monday? Just -6, right? No, don't tell me. Ellie told you a little bit about what we're celebrating today, Religious Freedom Day. It's actually the 239th anniversary of the passage of that Virginia Statute for religious freedom. Thomas Jefferson was the author of it, and he was so proud of what he passed, and he should have been, that he asked for 3 things to be inscribed on his gravestone. And the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, the founder of the University of Virginia, and the author of the Declaration of Independence were the 3. Not even that he was president. It's kind of interesting. It's noteworthy, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, because it's seen as the underlier for the religious freedom protections in our Constitution, the inspiration for those protections. And it was radical. It was radical at that time. Do you realize that protecting religious freedom, protecting the right of us to think freely, is an American original? It was the first time that a country decided to do that when we did that here. And 239 years ago is not that long. I was visiting, my son is studying at Oxford right now in England, and I walked by a building, wanted to know when it was from, the year 1000. But I think it's important that we remember how young the American experiment is, right? And that church-state separation and religious freedom is really part of that experiment, and we need to fight so hard to protect it, in particular in this moment. One more thing about religious freedom. Years after the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom was passed, so it was 1821, Thomas Jefferson wrote his autobiography. And it was interesting the way he described the purpose of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. He said it was to protect the Jew and the Gentile, the Hindu, the Mohammedan, and the infidel of every faith. And I just want to ask you to imagine with me how very radical that was, for that time. The misinformation that's abounding about religious freedom and even church-state separation is astounding. And so today we have to work very hard to protect church-state separation and to fight back against that really disinformation. Because why do we need to work so hard? Because, as Suzanne was saying, there's a second story about religious freedom right now in America, and it's much darker, right? And this isn't the first time that we've seen religious freedom wielded as a sword, right? Instead of as the shield that it's supposed to be, but it's happening with a renewed vigor all across the country. And it's happening because of Christian nationalism, which is rooted in the lie that America was founded for Christians and, frankly, European Christians. That's what the polls show Christian nationalists believe, and that our laws and policies must continue to privilege and favor those people. And it's hurting all of us is the thing, even the Christian nationalists, because America wouldn't be America without church-state separation and religious freedom. But, the bad news and the good news is the way it affects so many of us. Last night, I talked about a Jewish couple from Tennessee, from Knoxville, who tried to adopt a little special needs boy and went to their local taxpayer-funded foster care agency, and they were turned away because they're Jewish in 2021 in America. They're our clients in one of our lawsuits. And I told the folks last night about Amy Madonna, a Catholic woman in South Carolina, in Simpsonville, South Carolina, who is this saintly mom of these autistic boys who she homeschools. I've been with her in her living room, and she goes to her local taxpayer-funded is the key here, just to be clear, foster care agency, to say, I really want to work with these kids and volunteer. You should hear her talk. I'll bring tears, I want to buy them ice cream. I want to make them feel loved. I want to, et cetera, et cetera. She was turned away because the last question they asked her on her application is just one more question. What's your church? She told them her parish. She's Catholic. And she was turned away because she's not Protestant. And it affects the 9 families in our lawsuit in Louisiana, where the governor signed into law a requirement that all public schools display the 10 commandments. And those families are Christian and Jewish and Unitarian and non-religious, right? And they don't want their kids to, number one, be taught about religion, even a religion that is allegedly theirs, to the Jews and Christians, in public schools by public school teachers instead of by them or at their houses of worship. And they also don't want our children divided into categories of in-groups and out-groups, putting them at risk of being ostracized or even bullied based on their religious beliefs. So this is a very dangerous movement that we're up against, and Suzanne's right. And it's so perverted that they're taking something that's so beautiful, right? Religious freedom, right? Which is like this mosaic of differences, and celebrating that, and instead turning it on its head and turning religious freedom into a code word for religious privilege and religious favor for some, hurting people, right? Using it as a license to hurt people. Because let me be clear about what religious freedom is. It's the freedom to believe as you choose, so long as you don't harm other people. Because if you're allowed to harm other people, then the government's favoring your religion over others. And that's what America doesn't do, or over non-religion. So what I told also the crowd last night is there's good news here, and it's that we have an antidote to fight for, and it's called church-state separation. For real, think about it, because Christian nationalists want to embed their narrow political religious views into the law. And church-state separation says, nuh-uh, you can't do that, right? So our lawsuits are all being brought under church-state separation protections in the federal constitution, but also in state constitutions, because every state constitution protects church-state separation, which is wonderful. Church-state separation is what enables religious freedom for all. And I know I'm talking to, preaching to the choir, but it's sort of shocking how cerebral church-state separation can be. People don't link it to what it's about, actually. I mean, people link it to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and frankly, that can be good, but for a younger generation, that can also be hurtful to the cause, in part because there are some mixed feelings about our founders, right? We've exposed recently that though they got church-state separation right, they also got a lot wrong. And so it's really important today for folks to understand what church-state separation is about, how it does show up in your daily life. And I like to say it's about your right to believe as you choose, which even that not everyone gets, but that's pretty basic, right? It protects your right to believe, but it also protects your right to live as yourself, to love who you love, to do whatever you need to do with your body, right? To seek the reproductive care that you need, etc. So I think that side of church-state separation is something that we all have to really work to expose today. I would also say one more thing about church-state separation. It prevents us from being divided. And again, that's one of those really elementary things about it because our founders knew that, right? And they came from those divisions. And obviously you look around the world at the religious wars and it's sort of, it's super obvious. But even here, right, think of our country where we're intentionally diverse. We intentionally are a country of religious freedom, right? That welcomes people from different backgrounds, different races, different religious, everything. We're a country that really is rooted in pluralism, right? That's who we are. It's in our DNA. Right here in this room, we have it, right? And what enables us to coexist in peace is that the government isn't saying you're better than you. You know, our government here is saying we're all equal. Now, not exactly. We haven't attained our ideals and we need to keep working towards them, but mostly, or at least that's something that we can point to in our founding documents and say, this is a country that is not just premised in freedom, it's premised in equality. And it's church-state separation that's one of the keys to freedom and equality. So let me just leave you with hope. I had the luxury of having breakfast this morning with an Americans United for Separation of Church and State supporter who I'm looking for. You here, Paul? There he is. And we had a great time. And Paul, you know, you mentioned this word that just stuck with me because I think I hear it. I have call time every week, like politicians, and I speak to our members from across the country, which is good. It keeps me in touch, you know, with everyone. And I hear the word despair all the time these days. And I think we can all probably relate to that word right now. And I truly believe that we need to fight, right? We need to fight for our rights. But the good news is on church-state separation, we have the Constitution, we have the state constitutions, we have the DNA of our country, and we have the power of the people, all with us because we all share a stake. We are protected by it, really all of us, right? I think the key ingredient to our winning is to hold on to hope. I really do. And to believe in the power of our voices, to believe that when we come together, like today, when we come together from advocacy groups and from being politicians and as faith leaders and citizens that are engaged civically, that's exactly how we've done it, right? All across our history, and it's how we'll do it today. So I really love this quote from Amanda Gorman, right, who at another more distant inauguration, read a beautiful poem. And in the poem was the line, "There is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it." So may we all be the light. And I'm looking forward to the panel today. So shall we bring them up? All right.
Thank you, Rachel. If the panel one would like to ascend to the stage, I'm going to introduce you while you're walking up here. So first of all, we have Reverend Angela Denker, who is an ELCA Lutheran pastor and veteran journalist. Her first book, Red State Christians, examines the white Christian nationalists who gave the presidency to Donald Trump in 2016. Her new book, Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood, will be released in March. And if you want to find out how to pre-order that book, go down to the reception and you'll get a clue. Representative Mike Freiberg is a founding member and co-chair of the Minnesota Legislature's Secular Government Caucus. He, among many other things, is author of bills that would allow medical aid in dying for terminally ill Minnesotans and ensure that non-religious options are available to people who are mandated to participate in drug or alcohol recovery programs. Kirsten Schuett is founder and executive director of the School Board Integrity Project, which recruits and trains school board candidates to counter efforts to erode our public education systems, for example, by imposing book bans or policies that discriminate against LGBTQ students. Founded in 2023 in Minnesota, it's now active in 18 states. So take it away, panel one.
All right. thanks. Wait, let's see. It's on. Okay, hello. Did anyone catch Representative Freiberg taking a selfie of the panel? Okay. All right. That's a great start for the panel. The first panel is about Christian nationalism, how it's rearing its ugly head even in the blue state of Minnesota, and how folks are fighting back. That's really the topic for this panel. So Representative Freiberg, I'll start with you. Can you set the stage for sort of what we're seeing as the status of religious freedom and church-state separation here in Minnesota? Okay, Minnesota. And, especially within the state legislature.
Sure. Just a little pushback. I mean, it's true, we have not elected a Republican to statewide office since 2006. But it's a little closer, especially in the legislature. There's a 1-seat Democratic majority in the state Senate, and I don't even know what's going on in the House anymore. The election yielded a tie, but there's been a lot going on. That's a topic for a different day, though. But there certainly are threats to the separation of church and state in Minnesota. I just have some notes. I'm not like checking scores of games or anything on here, but so I just have some notes. Like part of the reason that we decided to form the Secular Government Caucus, Senator John Marty, I know, had some experiences where there was a 10 Commandments bill being debated in the state Senate, and he made some comments on the Senate floor, and he got attacked on Fox News for it. And there've been bills introduced since then. I'm sure we'll see them in the House this year, which is at this point hopefully a tie, but we'll see. At last session there was a bill allowing prayer on the sidelines of sporting events after the Supreme Court decision in the Coach Kennedy case. There are definite threats in Minnesota as well, and the Secular Government Caucus, I think, is primed to be a voice against greater church-state complications.
And Reverend Danker, I'll call you Angela, but want to emphasize that you're a reverend. You've written about and researched right Christian nationalism, really, and how it shows up around the country. And in your first book, Red State Christians, A Journey into White Christian Nationalism and the Wreckage It Leaves Behind, you also looked at this question. So, and obviously your upcoming book, which I'm really excited about, Disciples of White Jesus, the Radicalization of American Boyhood, obviously is about this topic too. So why don't you share some insights with this group about what you've learned from your studies about this movement and also about its presence in Minnesota?
Yes. Well, thank you so much for having me be here. It's great to be here and not necessarily a space that I expected I would be invited to when I first started seminary. So I love how Ellie always says, we see religious folks as our allies. I think that's just such a healthy perspective. And I'm super happy to have members of my congregation here as well. So it's really wonderful. But yes, this has been a long journey for me. I was pastoring a church that was Lutheran in name, but more evangelical in style and certainly in staffing in Orange County, California, in the same town that is the birthplace of Richard Nixon. We were right next door to the Nixon Library during the 2016 election. And so I really had a front row seat to watch evangelicals fall in line and go from sort of, maybe Ted Cruz, maybe Ben Carson, to just all in behind Donald Trump. So began watching that 2015 evangelical conferences where I once thought that's the main stage I would be on. How about that? They were not interested in a woman pastor. Anyway, so from watching that build up to moving back here to Minnesota, my home state, in 2017, and having this first book come out, traveling across the country, and then really so the first version of Red State Christians came out in 2019, and the initial subtitle of the book, you heard the new one from Rachel. The initial subtitle in 2019 was Understanding the Voters Who Elected Donald Trump. And so to this day, when people meet me and hear about my book, they often say to me, well, help me understand. Help me understand. And I say, I'm still understanding, even after, I kind of have come to hate that subtitle because in some ways it's not necessarily about understanding, but about coping and about boundaries. But so I'm a person who spent a lot of time in right-wing spaces, and having come back to Minnesota and in preparation for the release of the new version of Red State Christians, where we really put white Christian nationalism in the subtitle. From 2019 to 2023, I was living in Ilhan Omar's congressional district and pastoring a congregation in McLeod County, Minnesota, where over 75% of the county voted for Donald Trump. So I found myself very much living in two different worlds, not only in my community and my pastoring, but also in my own family, which I know many of you could relate to. And I loved, I really related to hearing our governor say he could too relate to that in his own family. So I continue to watch these trends develop. And I continue I love your focus on hope, Rachel, because I continue to have experiences that remind me to push back against the easy categorization of one another into enemies or friends, or the easy categorization of one another as either evil or good. For me, as a pastor, the faith that I was raised with, the same faith as Senator Marty, he and I share that distinction. I was made an example of on Breitbart. But the faith that I was raised with really taught me that Jesus had that same example. Jesus reached out to people outside the traditional Jewish faith that he was brought up in. And he really had that example of tolerance in many ways. So I'm so grateful to be here and pass on the mic.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for owning the fact that you're still embracing the complexities of understanding it, and also for living in both worlds and coming out the other side to be able to teach us. Kirsten, school boards. I think it's fair to say that we've all woken up to how important they are. It took a minute. But yeah, why don't you talk with us about how you're seeing white Christian nationalism manifest at the school board level?
Yeah, absolutely. So school boards, your reaction is the reaction I get every single day. And although people are definitely waking up to the importance of school boards, we still continue to have this conversation with folks about this is really, quite frankly, where it's ground zero in the fight against Christian nationalism. So often these conversations from extreme organizations like Moms for Liberty here in Minnesota, the Minnesota Parents Alliance, a lot of really incredibly conservative and extremely, frankly, extreme groups, right? They are intentionally sowing seeds on the school board level. This is their testing ground to see what sticks, right? Where they're talking about parents' rights and things that are incredibly emotionally charged on purpose. Because that's definitely the place where we can move the margins very quickly. School board elections, like you said, a lot of folks probably don't really know what's happening at their school boards, particularly a few years ago. Now folks are paying a little more attention when we're talking about book bans and these extreme things that are taking place. But the reality is that we have a very small majority or very small minority of voters that make decisions on the school board level. In any given school board election, between 5 and 10% of registered voters actually make the decisions, which means that we are having an extremely outsized voice from those extreme organizations who are organizing their folks, who are having those conversations. And frankly, they've been doing this for decades. And so when I started the School Board Integrity Project in 2023, it really was kind of a dovetail of my personal experience as an LGBTQ student in Anoka Hennepin, which those of you that know that district know that they have not been terribly great with LGBTQ youth, and I was not the first nor the last LGBTQ-centered lawsuit against the district when we lost 9 students to suicide over the course of a year because of their neutrality policies that were put in place, right? Same language that we're hearing yet again today, 13 years later, I'm fighting against that same information and making sure that we're actually getting folks to where we need to go, and we do that by ensuring we have great candidates who are recruited to run for office, people who actually want to do the work of school boards, which isn't always sexy, right? It's really actually kind of boring. And so making sure that we're able to have those conversations and that they understand how to run sophisticated campaigns is at the core of what we do.
I'm just curious, where do you get your funding from for the School Board Integrity Project?
I see some friends in the area doing this, my staff in the back, yes. It's mostly individual donations, quite frankly, and we've supported over 400 candidates in just about 2 years. 40 or over 70 districts in Minnesota and across 18 states. So we have grown rapidly. There is definitely not a lack of work for our small but mighty team. So individual donations is great, but if you know any other folks who are interested in supporting us, my finance director would I'd be remiss to not be able to make that ask.
I definitely wanted to ask you that, in front of everyone, because
I appreciate it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's. I think, though, intellectually, we've all woken up to how important the local scene is. We probably, our pocketbooks haven't really caught up to that epiphany yet. Like, I feel like federal national foundations should be pouring money into groups like the School Board Integrity Project. So I think it's great that you're doing that. Yeah, and I guess, Angela, I wanted to ask you, because you're also a parent, in addition to being a pastor, and wondered how you were seeing these issues show up and also how you're dealing with it.
Yeah, not only as a parent of 2 boys in the Minneapolis public schools, but also as the daughter and daughter-in-law of 2 retired public school teachers. My mom taught in Osseo, so not far from Anoka Hennepin. It's really important, and we see just immense pressure being put on educators. My brother is, someone who was a public school teacher in the North Dallas suburbs and left because of the intense pressure being put on teachers to conform. And, it's a very hostile environment. And I have seen the ways in which it's disincentivized in some ways to be engaged, and so I have a chapter on schools in my new book on white boys and men, and watching the ways that we're lacking a clear path forward, and so I support and appreciate the work that you're doing, Kirsten, in your organization. And I think putting on my other hat is as a journalist, right now for columns for the Star Tribune and a long history in sports writing. I think one of the most important things that people can do when it comes to supporting the work of public schools and finding out what's happening on school boards and how the separation of church and state, is an important tool in educating Americans and keeping public schools strong, especially in rural Minnesota, where there's not a wealth of other options. I think one of the most important things that people can do is support independent media that is covering these topics, put pressure on journalists and on mainstream media organizations to cover what's going on. Write your letters to the editor at the Star Tribune. Keep people informed. Email. Star Tribune has a great education reporter, Mara Klecker. So keep on her to be covering these issues, because as Rachel points out, a lot of people don't have access to information about what's going on, and the access that they do have is propaganda. And I see the ways in which that propaganda is hurting teachers and hurting students within our schools particularly. And for parents like me who are in districts that maybe we're not, in Minneapolis public schools, Moms for Liberty does not have a foothold. That's right. That's right. And I'm sure that they're finding unique ways to get in there through, they're trying to get through conservative social issues, maybe looking at Somali parents. All that to say, to find ways to partner with districts that are under threat, to find ways to share resources across districts. I'm in a corner of Southwest Minneapolis that is heavily resourced. How do we find ways to support other districts and their access to religious freedom, to have speakers in schools from religious minority groups, just continuing to find ways to empower that next generation.
So this was making me think, and this wasn't on our list of pre-conversation, I'll warn you, but it was making me think that often when I've been on more conservative radio, I've sort of gotten the argument, but when they're teaching about LGBTQ equality in public schools, they're imposing secularism, right? I'm sure you've heard a version of this, and it's really like against our religious beliefs. And actually, you probably all saw that the Supreme Court just took a case out of Maryland with some lead plaintiffs who are Muslim even about parents who want the right to opt out of their kids reading books that feature LGBTQ folks. I know what I say, but I wanted to know if any of you kind of wanted to explain how you deal with those types of arguments.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to take the question. I think that it really comes down at the core. They're trying to undermine public education, right? And they're trying to silence voices that are different, whether that is the LGBTQ community, whether that is communities of color. It really does come down to a very singular focus, right? A singular perspective that they want to teach. And there are schools that teach those singular perspectives, and they are welcome to go to there. But when we are talking about our public schools and our public education and our tax dollars paying for it, it really is about ensuring that everybody sees themselves, feels represented, and can find that, right, within their schools. And so that's the way that we talk about it. We want to make sure that, everybody has the freedoms to read and learn, and make sure that they have that opportunity in their public education classrooms.
You want to add to that?
I have maybe a long sermon on this, so I will disdain from that. But one of the most frustrating things I see in this assumption when they're saying that if you're teaching LGBTQ tolerance as promoting secularism, what you're doing by default is equating Christianity with right-wing Christian nationalism, which it is not. There are numerous biblical examples. I'm thinking back to the story of the Ethiopian eunuch, where we're lifting up Jesus, and the Bible is lifting up folks who are maybe not cisgender, maybe not heterosexual. There's long history and current present day religious leaders, Christian leaders who are not cisgender, who are LGBTQ. And so to erase those folks and their leadership, many of whom are friends of mine and people who I think have done immense help in spreading the gospel, is really, really problematic to me, and I think really gets at the heart of this argument for Christian nationalism that erases historical Christianity. So when they say, well, if you're teaching LGBTQ tolerance, you're also promoting secularism. For those of us Christians who want to say, no, our faith is what leads us to support LGBTQ tolerance. And I'm somebody who went on that journey. I wasn't always here. We've got to help people, take people on that journey sometimes. But that erases a really wide swath of Christian truth. And I think we need to push back on that from a faith-based perspective.
Just a short addition too. I mean, I'm fortunate. My kid, the school board where my kids go to, in the public school district where my kids go, has some personality issues, but imposing Christian nationalist views is not one of the issues they have. But at the legislature, though, we see those issues reflected when we try to discuss or advance a bill encouraging comprehensive sexual education. That's incredibly important for kids. Many kids don't get that sort of education at their home, and particularly if they're in a very religious household, and that can lead to all sorts of health problems and unplanned pregnancies and that sort of thing. So But just it's such an uphill climb. It's such a heavy lift to get that bill through. And now that we have this current situation in the Minnesota House, it's going to be even harder. But we're certainly continuing to fight for it at the legislature.
More on that. I mean, so what this is a microcosm of how we might win, right? Like, what is the strategy there, for dealing with that kind of a bill and trying to push it through?
I think just education is huge. I mean, unfortunately, it becomes really partisan. So honestly, I feel like the best strategy is an electoral one. Just elect progressive Democrats. That's, maybe a simplification, but, both parties, if you talk to the average person on the street, even if they're a Republican, I think most, regular people, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, don't want to be bigots. They don't want to be mean to people who are different than them. They want to be welcoming. But when you encounter legislators, elected officials who are Democrats or Republicans, then things get a lot harder. There are interest groups in the legislature that have incredible influence, particularly on the Republican side of the aisle, trying to impose these views on people. And it's gotten more and more polarized. There used to be pro-choice, Republican legislators in the House. I used to be represented by a pretty progressive Republican who I think she's a Unitarian even, which is kind of hard to believe. But those sorts of those days are gone. We don't have those. So I don't know. I'd love to give a more encouraging answer that we can educate our Republican colleagues on issues like this, but it's just seeming less and less likely.
And I would say from my study of Christian nationalism, the reason that's true is because it's not about reason. It's about, I wonder if anyone knows the word I'm going to use. Power. Yeah, money, power. It's about power, which is often linked to money. Yeah, and so that's really a lot of the driving force here. It's a movement that's about securing power for a select few over everyone else. And you can see how that really shouldn't be a winning strategy. But with the power that they already have, it's very self-perpetuating. And I guess, Angela, I wanted to ask you what you, as a Christian leader, sort of what you think about Christians' role in fighting back against this Christian nationalism that we're witnessing.
Yeah, I think that, again, both in my view as a religious leader and also as a writer and a journalist, I pause for a moment at the words, because I think we have to be really cynical and really aware of the ways in which words are being weaponized. I'm pausing even at the word Christian and the ways that word, if you ask the average person, particularly Americans, 40 and under, barely still there, guys. Couple more months for me. They will say that Christians are defined by race and by political views, much more than by religious views. That the idea that being a Christian in America is synonymous with being a white Republican has been borne out in surveys of Christian nationalists and surveys about Christian nationalism. So I think it's hard for me to even answer first, because I'm a little bit worried about, a monolithic Christian movement to oppose Christian nationalism seems really difficult when that word Christian for so many folks has come to mean anything but the historical teachings of Jesus. So I pause there on that word and think about ways in which I think Christians who want to resist Christian nationalism have to be really wise about how do we define ourselves to people who may have a lot of opinions and thoughts about what it means to be a Christian that doesn't comport to what we believe. So we have to be really ready to defend that. And in the same way, be able to explain how religious freedom really means the freedom to discriminate when it's coming from a Christian perspective. And we've seen that in Minnesota, certainly.
I was just going to say, and interested in what others think too, that we religious minorities, I think I was announced as the Jew that I am. I've never told people more regularly that I'm Jewish. I've also been on Breitbart and Fox and attacked by a lot of folks, including a lot of Jews who are like, why are you leading this organization and hurting us by doing that? I mean, not because church-state separation obviously protects Jews, but hurting us because you're Jewish, and so how can you do a good job of leading this organization? But I will say that it was funny, when I first started at Americans United almost 7 years ago, my parents, who are in Chicago, said to me, I really hope that there aren't just a bunch of Jews working there. And I was like, actually, don't worry about it, because I wish that there were like a few more Jews working there. There's actually not. But I would just say that from the perspective of the 2% Jewish minority that I am, that we take a lot of comfort in Christians saying they're Christian who are fighting Christian nationalism, because Christians are a majority in this country. And as I said last night, and sort of shocking to a lot of people, that in 2014 we stopped being a majority white and Christian country, and that right there explains a whole lot. But we're certainly a majority Christian country, and so given that reality, it feels important for Christians to reclaim it rather than abandon it. Any other thoughts from panelists on that one? No?
Not really. I don't feel qualified to speak about what it means to be Christian.
Well, okay. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the secular caucus then?
Well, sure. Yeah, we like I said, Senator, I think some Audrey and some people from the Humanists approached us a few years ago about the possibility of creating it. It was modeled after the Congressional Free Thought Caucus in D.C. And we went around a bit about the name. We ultimately decided on the Secular Government Caucus because, we felt that calling ourselves the Secular Caucus might imply that everybody who belongs to it is a secular person. I happen to be that. I'm not a religious person, but Senator Marty is very much so. He's very connected to his Lutheran faith, and so we just wanted it to, we wanted it to be clear that we were advocating for the separation of church and state, for a secular government, and not so much just the advancement of secular people. So we did that, and there have been a couple issues we've been involved in, and we haven't taken a position specifically on different pieces of legislation as a caucus, but there have been a couple instances where the chairs have written letters or gotten involved in different issues. But there are certain bills that I'd say there's a wide overlap between our membership and support for it. I've been chief author of Medical Aid in Dying. That's a very important issue, I know, to a lot of secular people. A lot of religious people as well want that. I know that's going to be a bigger topic on the next panel, so I won't get into great detail on that. There's this piece of legislation, the Secular Recovery Act, that says that if you are required by a court to go through substance abuse treatment, you can't be required to have a religious component to it, because many people, the only option to them is a 12-step program, which has a requirement that you have to acknowledge a belief in a higher power, which not everybody does. So we just say that if there's no other option for the person, that religious requirement can't be imposed. So there's a lot of issues I think we're concerned about. There's certainly going to be a lot of battlegrounds, I think, to fight on certainly in the Minnesota House this year. So I expect we'll be very active this year.
And well, let me ask you this. I'm assuming that you get accused, the Secular Caucus, of being anti-religion. Do you?
Honestly, I don't know that they take us seriously enough to bother lobbing attacks at us. But yes, I think that would certainly be a line of attack they would use. And I just point to the fact that, Senator Marty is the son of a minister. He's very connected to his Lutheran faith. We just want to make sure people's religious beliefs aren't imposed on others. And I think there's a lot of people who share that belief. And yeah.
Kirsten, do you deal with that sort of anti-religion stuff, or is that something that sort of figures prominent in your fighting back, and how do you deal with it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of it, especially in the argument around parents' rights and book bans and what curriculum we're putting forward and what is right, is definitely something that we see every day in a conversation that we're constantly having. I mean, and when we, like I said before, I think that school boards really kind of are the testing and battleground for this, because it's really easy to do some insidious things on a very micro level when people aren't paying attention. Right? Like, I don't know if anybody's like really thought deeply about their school board before a couple of years ago, right? It's just something that happened, particularly those of us that don't have children, right? I tell people all the time, school board elections are the only election where you need to convince people that they have the right to vote. Because every day on the campaign trail, we would have to tell people that it's okay if you don't have children, you can and should participate in your school board elections because it matters for the future workforce and so many incredible things. And, you know, there are things that we see then ultimately trickle up to the legislature, right? Like here in Minnesota, we passed the ban on book bans, which is great. But at the same time, we then got to see, you know, efforts in Osseo and other places where they're trying to get a little tricky and slippery and figure out how they can go around those book ban policies. And, you know, in St. Francis, they just imposed a policy where they're looking at the center of their policy is actually around a website called Book Looks, which is led by Moms for Liberty. Anybody can challenge a book, and there are no professionals. There's no media specialists, librarians, anybody like that. It's genuinely the basis for if books are allowed in the library or not. It's through this website. And that was just passed maybe a month and a half ago in St. Francis. So we see that. And, you know, I think about things like campaign finance law. We were talking about power and money a little bit ago. And the reality is that you can do some really insidious things on the school board level because it's really hard to track. Right? And so they can spend tens of thousands of dollars across 300 plus school districts in Minnesota. And we don't know, unless you're like me in the spreadsheets and connecting all the red thread and sound a little tinfoil hatty most days. But the reality is that we really need to pay attention to what's happening here because the things we start to hear on the ground in school board elections are the things that do ultimately trickle up. And so the more that we can do that, I think it's going to be really important. And the last thing that I'll say, there's another organization that we're currently working kind of to uncover a bit more, and that's an organization called LifeWise. So for those of you that made that noise, I know you know what it is. But for those of you that don't, it's Joel Penton's, and it's a Bible-based character education for public school students. Let me emphasize that again. Public school students. And it's a $6 million organization, and there's programs in 600 districts across 30 states. And for those of you that say Minnesota's blue, it's okay. Here in Minnesota, more than 150 districts are in their 10-step program to getting LifeWise into school districts. And some of them are as far as step 7 and 10. And, you know, we saw just an argument in Pine City a handful of weeks ago. And so we need to make sure that we're paying attention to that, because although those of us in Minneapolis and Golden Valley and Crystal and the kind of first ring suburbs here that are represented all on this stage, we think about it as it being safe seats, but I can tell you that we combat Moms for Liberty, Minnesota Parents Alliance, LifeWise in every single district across the state, and we need to make sure that we're paying attention to that.
Yeah, and that just reminds me to just say for a moment sort of how devastating and countrywide the attacks are on public education right now. I don't know how many of you have read about the nation's first religious public school. Yep. Some, okay, yeah, in Oklahoma, St. Isidore's, a full-on Catholic school that states outrightly that it will discriminate against families that don't share their religious beliefs or their moral code. And the virtual charter school board in that state voted to allow them to be a charter school, which by statute is absolutely a public school, no dispute. And so we sued at Americans United, and so did the Republican Attorney General. And right now, you know, that case is potentially going to go up to the Supreme Court. They've filed a cert petition with the Supreme Court. So any day we're going to learn about that one. Also in Oklahoma, there's the Bible mandate that's come from Superintendent Ryan Walters, who's the epitome of Christian nationalism in a suit, if it's not Representative Mike Johnson, who's another one of them, the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. But he's, you know, ordered that the Bible be taught in public schools and that teachers teach from the Bible and teach it as core values. And then, you know, you've got Louisiana's 10 Commandments mandate. You got Texas and their Blue Bonnet curriculum, which is teaching elementary school children from the Bible. You've got Texas and Louisiana and Florida that have all passed laws that allow schools, public schools to replace certified school counselors with chaplains. So we're organizing on the ground and fighting that. In Idaho and Kentucky, they passed laws after the Coach Kennedy praying football case that my organization lost at the Supreme Court, that would allow teachers and coaches to pray alongside of and even with students in public schools. West Virginia passed a law that is meant to usher in the teaching of intelligent design creationism in public schools. So it is rampant and ramping up. So are you anticipating seeing, did I get the 5-minute warning?
I'm
Oh.
afraid our time is up.
Oh, shoot. Okay. Well, we'll conclude on that sour note.
Sorry, I'm the time police. Let's give a big hand for the panel. We're now going to take a 10-minute break, so feel free to go out, use the restrooms, or get some water or coffee. But we're really going to limit it to 10 minutes so that we keep on schedule. So please come back in 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay, everybody. Time to get back into the room, and we'll get started on our second panel. Okay. I'm going to introduce the panelists like I did before, and they can come up to the stage as I introduce them. First panelist is Representative Esther Abadje, who is also a member of Minnesota Legislature's Secular Government Caucus. She is author of the Reproductive Freedom Defense Act, which protects patients who travel here from states with draconian anti-abortion laws and their providers from legal repercussions. So you've heard that Minnesota is an abortion refuge state. She has a lot to do with that. Jess Braverman is the legal director of Gender Justice, where she supervises litigation to advance the group's mission of removing barriers to gender equity. This includes a current lawsuit charging that a Catholic high school violated the Minnesota Human Rights Act by effectively terminating a staff librarian after she came out as trans. Audrey Kingstrom is a humanist celebrant helping to plan and officiate at ceremonies to mark life transitions. She's also a board member for HumanistsMN and a longtime volunteer with Compassion and Choices, which advocates for expanded choices and improved care at the end of life. Before we start the panel, I just want to see if anybody needs a comment card to ask questions. Ashley's your woman. And we will call all the panelists up for the Q&A. So your question can be to anybody, any member of the two panels. Okay, take it away.
Okay, great. Welcome back, everyone. This is the second and last panel, and then we'll go downstairs and drink and be merry and learn and chat. This panel is a little bit more personal because it's really about our individual freedoms and our bodily integrity, our right to make decisions about our own bodies. It's about being able to identify how you choose to express your sexuality in a way that's true to yourself, to seek the reproductive care that you desire and need, and to end your life in the way that is right for you. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. I'm really excited because from my perspective as the president of a national church-state separation organization, one of the things I've noticed is we don't always connect on the abstract principle, but when we connect it to the ways that church-state separation shows up in your daily life in a very personal way, we really do connect in a new way. And so to me, that's what this panel is largely about. So Representative Agbaje, I wanted to start with you and this wonderful Reproductive Freedom Defense Act that was signed into law almost 2 years ago. I wanted you to remind us what that law does.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here with everybody. So 2 years ago, as you heard from Representative Freiberg, the Democrats were in the majority. And so in Minnesota, we took that opportunity, especially after the Dobbs ruling came out, to ensure that we enshrined reproductive freedom into our laws. So one of the bills, which I was honored to carry, is known as the Reproductive Freedom Defense Act. And so basically what that law does is it actually protects the healthcare providers. So the doctors, the nurses, the physician's assistants, the pharmacists, when they provide reproductive health care up to and including abortions, that is something that they can't be prosecuted for because it is legal to do in Minnesota. So it's about what's legal in Minnesota. The other aspect of this law now also protects those same providers if they provide care to someone who maybe fled a more hostile state, say Texas. If they came to Minnesota And then they went back to Texas, and Texas wanted to prosecute the providers in Minnesota. They could not do that because they were acting lawfully in the state of Minnesota. The law also protects patient records. So your records cannot be subpoenaed for receiving reproductive care. And it also allows the Board of Medical Practice in Minnesota to be able to continue to license doctors who move into Minnesota if they were being prosecuted or their record was being tarnished because they provided reproductive care that met the laws in the state of Minnesota and was within the scope of practice. So that's a lot of detail, but basically what it says is that if you receive reproductive care in Minnesota, you are protected. You can't be prosecuted by a more hostile state, particularly if you're coming from a more hostile state, or if you're a medical provider in Minnesota, you're protected. So that's what we fought for 2 years ago, particularly with Jess and the gender justice team. They were really strong allies with us for that. And then so many people across the state of Minnesota who had stories of wanting to make sure that their health care overall was protected.
Well, a huge congratulations. Huge. It is really so important, and like many things, like you miss it more when you don't have it, and sometimes when you have it, it's easier to take for granted. I wanted to follow up on that to understand how you see the connection between reproductive freedom and religious freedom, and also whether sort of that connection came up at all in the context of this now law.
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think, both of those freedoms are really about how you live your life in the way that you want to, right? So from a reproductive freedom aspect, particularly as a woman, when and how you would want to have a child, right? And then can you also keep that child and raise that child in the way that you want to? And I think that also intersects with your religious or spiritual life in making sure that you can practice the religion or the spirituality that you want to as well. So all of those are very personal. And I think kind of the role of the government in that space is ensuring that you have the ability and the opportunity to practice what you want to practice, as long as it's not harming someone else, but not imposing on you about what you should be practicing. So I think that's kind of how they intersect. Those two, like in that specific way, didn't quite come up during the debates. A lot of people had more questions about the legality of it, the constitutionality of it, the various clauses in our U.S. Constitution about how states interact with each other on civil and criminal cases. But people didn't really quite make that distinction about, their religious liberty in this process.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, in your case, you were on the offensive, but in a state like Missouri, where we brought a lawsuit on behalf of 14 clergy from 7 different religious backgrounds, we were on the defensive, challenging the abortion ban in that state. And the abortion ban actually codified religious language. The Lord Almighty is the author of life, and talked about from a religious perspective when life begins. Also, the lawmakers that supported the bill on the floor talked very openly about the religious motivations for the bill. As a Catholic, I do believe that life begins at conception. And, there was just blatant religious motivation for the bill. So in that case, I think it was even more clear that there was a connection, and we used religious voices a lot to join with the non-religious and fight back. Did you have religious leaders that were involved in advocacy around this bill?
This one, no, but I think our Pro-Life Act bill, which is the one that enshrined the access to reproductive health care in Minnesota, that one we had a lot more discussions about religious freedom there. But I think for this one, which was so technical about what crimes or liabilities you would be open to, people weren't really thinking about religiosity in that space. But I think you're right. They probably should have been, because if they were claiming that on the discussions about the Pro Act, those should have carried to this as well.
Yeah, no criticism at all. Just interesting to see kind of where it's showing up, and also that you didn't feel you needed it here, Jess, I wanted to talk a little bit about gender justice. Maybe you could tell folks who aren't familiar about your group, and then also, Jess is a lawyer, and Jess and I actually met at a contraception roundtable that we both joined in DC and then virtually, which was fun. But people don't always think about lawyers as storytellers, but from advocacy groups, I think we're increasingly realizing how important it is for us to be able to tell stories as lawyers, and how sort of an integrated advocacy can happen from a lawsuit. And I wanted folks to learn more about gender justice because it's such an important group, and also to hear maybe some stories from you.
Sure. So I'm Jess Braverman. I'm the legal director at Gender Justice, located in St. Paul, here in the Twin Cities. I'm originally from the Bronx, so I'm still getting used to I've lived here for 7 years. I'm still adjusting. And so we advance gender equity through the law, which for me as a lawyer, it's a fancy way of saying we sue people. And so we actually represented the first Unitarian Society of Minneapolis in a lawsuit challenging Minnesota's abortion restrictions. And we were successful 2 weeks after Dobbs, so 2 weeks after the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade. We won our lawsuit and got a number of Minnesota's abortion restrictions struck down and reinforced the idea that abortion is protected in our state constitution. And so if any of y'all are First Unitarian Society members, thank you for everything you did for joining our lawsuit. We also sued Anoka Hennepin for discriminating against trans people. But we've got a lot of lawsuits, and because of the work we do, I think people often think I'm like anti-religion. I'm also Jewish. Mm-hmm. My grandparents are Holocaust survivors. I grew up, like, my whole life was religious persecution, like hearing about religious persecution. My parents came to this country fleeing religious persecution from the communists in the USSR, where they weren't allowed to practice their religion. It's just like, for me, religious persecution is not like, I don't want to sell gay people cupcakes. Like, that's just not in my history, but I do take religious persecution seriously. I just don't think it should be used to treat other people terribly. And I don't think that should be controversial. So we did represent the First Unitarian Society. We've also brought the lawsuit against the Catholic school. They hired a librarian knowing she was Jewish, so it was just a secular position. Like, not only is she not a minister, she's not qualified to be a Catholic minister. Like, she's Jewish, she goes to synagogue, it's, but when she came out as trans, they fired her. And so we sued the school and we sued the archdiocese as well. And that lawsuit is currently going on in Hennepin County. We also sued a pharmacist who refused to sell our client emergency contraception. Emergency contraception is a time-sensitive medication. You have to take it right away, otherwise you could become pregnant. And for some people, pregnancy is dangerous, if not life-threatening. Like, some people just know, it doesn't have to be for you to deserve emergency contraception. For our client, she had a very medically complicated labor previously. She had a child. She couldn't risk that again. She was also a foster mom and wanted to make sure she could have room in her house for foster kids. So she got a condom broke. She got an emergency contraception prescription, and her pharmacist refused to fill it. But she lived in rural Minnesota, so she couldn't just go across the street. It's the CVS says no, so you go to the Rite Aid, or Dwayne Reed. Sorry, I'm like such a New Yorker. It's like Walgreens. Yeah, Walgreens. So you go to Walgreens. So you can't just cross the street. So she ended up having to go 2 miles round trip in a blizzard to get her medication, and she didn't become pregnant. But they didn't have a plan, and she wasn't the first. He had brought a young patient into a broom closet, closed the door, and told her she was killing a potential life. And our client wasn't the first that he had done this to, and the pharmacy didn't have a plan. So we sued them, and we were successful. We got a ruling from the Court of Appeals that is sex discrimination in Minnesota. And we're really proud of that ruling. And so we do bring a lot of cases where we believe in religious liberties. We just don't believe that it gives you the right to control how other people live their lives. And if you follow our cases, what you'll really see is the Catholic Conference writes an amicus brief in pretty much all of our cases against us. And I'm talking we sued USA Powerlifting, a secular powerlifting organization, for discriminating against women athletes in sport, and the Catholic Conference wrote an amicus brief. And I'm Jewish, so I don't know, but I don't think Jesus had an opinion on women's powerlifting. But it's because it's.
But Jesus was a Jew, so you might have an opinion.
He might, yeah. Well, so he had an opinion about everything.
Okay, exactly. Probably.
Yeah, he probably did have an
Very
opinion.
likely.
Yeah.
Very likely.
But it's because it's not. these things are happening, and it's not going to be overt all the time. Like, we're obviously they're going to file an amicus brief when we sue a religious pharmacist, but why are they participating? So when you look at who's pushing abortion bans, who's pushing like bans on trans girls in sports, it's the same exact organizations. It's the Heritage Foundation, the Alliance Defending Freedom. These are white Christian nationalist organizations pushing so that like 5th grade girls can't play kickball with their friends. Like what that has to do with religious liberty, there's only one thing, right? Like it's, back in the 90s and 80s, it was God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, right? It's the same thing. But for trans kids, right? Like God created like man and women, and you can't mess with that. And it's like, okay, but like, what if I'm not like of a religion that believes that? Like, why is that being enforced on me in sports in a public school? And so it's really insidious. We see it a lot. We do what we can to fight against it here in Minnesota. Often successful, and hopefully will continue to be.
Why do you think religious extremists across the country and in Minnesota are really coming for trans people in particular?
They found this like really great. So they've been trying forever, right? Like if you look at, there's school textbooks from the 70s that are like, they have actual pictures of like a man lurking by a tree, and it's like gay men lurk in the shadows to prey on kids, right? These are school textbooks from the, right? And so they're always saying like someone's a threat, right? Like gay people are a threat. If gay people are allowed to get married, their children will grow up to be a mess, because like we just don't have studies on what it's like to be a child of a gay couple, and like the world's gonna come crashing down. And so they try, and those ideas fall out of favor. They did it with bathrooms. Like, if you allow trans women in women's bathrooms, what you're allowing is men in women's bathroom, which is offensive. This is just what they say. And then there's going to be all these assaults and whatever. And it's like, trans women have been using women's bathrooms for decades. It's just, you don't know because it's so uneventful. Like nothing, like it's just like, it's like, if you don't realize that's happening, like, isn't that a sign that it's not actually dangerous? And so, so like they went from bathrooms, which they were mildly successful on. There's a long story there we don't have time for, but then they went to sports, and what they found was women's sports, like there's a lot of problems with women's sports, right? Like pay disparities, no support for women coaches, no resources, right? So they took something that really is demonstrably under threat, right? It's really scary, and there's a lot of people who remember what it was like before Title IX when you couldn't play sports, right? Like, so it's real. There are real threats to women's sports. It's just that trans athletes aren't one of them. Like, there's not enough like trans student athletes to like fill a sports team. Like it's just demonstrably untrue. It's demonstrably true that this is a scary topic for a lot of people. It's demonstrably untrue that the risk is trans people. But they found this great wedge issue. So you have pro-abortion feminists siding with Alliance Defending Freedom, who are passing abortion restrictions because of sports. And so what they did was they really found a way to drive a wedge, and it's really dangerous, and it's really caught on, including here in Minnesota, where we have to fight this like all the time.
And are you engaging the faith community in this work?
Yeah, so we do have when we have like rallies or events, and for trans kids, we do have faith leaders show up to those rallies. We have faith leaders come and speak at those rallies, and so we do have people of faith and faith leaders involved in our work on trans rights and our work on abortion rights and that sort of thing. Because for some people, like for the first Unitarians, and also for many Jewish groups, right, like abortion is a matter of religious freedom, because like for us, we have if the pregnant person needs an abortion to save her life and health, like it's actually a religious imperative. Like you have to give that person the abortion. And so an abortion ban actually does interfere with that religious right. So we do have religious leaders come and speak at our events and come and support our work. And
So we've talked about reproductive freedom. We've talked about LGBTQ equality, skim the surface, but began those conversations. Let's talk about medical aid in dying, which, Audrey, I know you've been a real champion for. And if you want to start by talking with us about the status of medical aid in dying legislation in Minnesota, and I know that Representative Freiberg wants to leave it to you. He referenced it, but tell us more.
Well, we kind of changed it up that way, set it up that way. I think everyone here knows what it is, medical aid in dying, but just if anyone is not familiar, it allows terminally ill, mentally capable adults with less than 6 months to live, to be able to get a doctor's prescription to end their lives, to ingest this medication and to end their lives peacefully. It's modeled after the Oregon Death with Dignity law that was passed about 25 years ago and has been a very successful legislation there. It's now in 10 states and in Washington, D.C., and we've introduced it here, Representative Freiberg has introduced it here since not that long ago, 2016, and it's come up every session and hasn't gotten real far. Death is still a hard topic for people, and even non-believers, but especially religious people. So it's really, and I'll talk more about that later, but it's stuck right now. And we have had some hearings. Last year was probably our most successful year. We got some hearings in the House, and the Senate wouldn't take it up. When we had control, all Democratic control, the Senate wouldn't take it up because even though we had a majority, there were a couple of Democratic senators who felt very strongly against it. What's interesting about this, well, I don't know if it's that interesting, as many things are in our country is changing, just as most people support abortion rights. Most people in the country do want to see medical aid in dying across the nation, and certainly even here in Minnesota. And surveys that have been taken, it has 73% support when they do surveys, and 20% opposition. Even among Catholics that were surveyed, 71% of Catholics said they supported medical aid in dying. And while this isn't a big majority, 53% of Republicans in a survey that was done here in Minnesota said they supported medical aid in dying. This year, the prospects do not look good. Everyone knows what's kind of going on in our state with the legislature. And Compassion and Choices as an organization does incredible work around the country. And we have an organizer here in the state, but she's also responsible for many other states. And they've sort of pulled back their focus on Minnesota this year because we are stuck and what's politically going on right now with the recent election. This is a bipartisan issue, and we should be able to pass this. I think as many of us know who are involved in electoral politics and are advocates and we lobby as citizen lobbyists, are frustrated. Our legislators do not represent the majority of people, because what is happening in this country, it's true, and you referenced it, Representative Freiberg, is we've got super right-wing Republicans now, and it's just really difficult to get that bipartisan support, even when a lot of the issues that we are advocating for do have bipartisan support among the population. That is why it is so important for us all to show up. But anyway, I'll stop talking about that right now.
Well, we want you to keep talking.
Okay.
Why is medical aid in dying a church-state separation issue?
That's because death is really seen, or the religious narrative still controls our discussion about death in this country. Even as our society is becoming more secular, death is often thought about in the way in terms of religious terms that are just a hangover from the past. And I'd like to give 3 examples. People often talk about death being in God's hands. God is going to determine when your time is up. And even though we have all the modern medicine and interventions in the world today that we have, when it comes to that moment of death, somehow we still think it's so out of our hands, and religious people use that a lot. Also, suffering is seen in some religious circles as a redeeming quality. And so this whole idea of suffering is like, okay, yes, that might happen at the end of your life, but that'll somehow help like purge you of like your sin or something. So there's really odd thoughts about suffering at the end of life. And also, they don't say this explicitly, but just as you were referencing, it's like, you know who the players are underneath it and who's really helping frame it, is oftentimes people couch medical aid in dying as suicide. And especially religious people, while they won't come out as saying they're doing that as a religious viewpoint, they do that intentionally to really sour the discussion. And so they frame it as suicide, and suicide is considered immoral. It's been considered immoral in many religious traditions for many, centuries. Instead, though, we need to look at, suicide is a mental health issue, and medical aid in dying is not suicide, and it's not a mental health issue. It's people who are dying and are actively dying, and we want to end suffering. And as humanists and many progressive religious people, it's all about putting an end to suffering and minimizing suffering, as opposed to somehow idealizing suffering. And also, the other thing I want to say is, in this whole discussion about separation of church and state, secular people, non-believers, non-theists, agnostics, we want to have recognition of our viewpoints in the public square as well. And as you have referenced last night, and I think most people here know, we are a growing demographic. It's just that we're not very organized. And so when I was, we used to I'm part of a group of activists and compassionate choices, and we would do these training sessions of how to lobby your representatives. And this was several years ago, and I was part of this workshop, and we were doing this. And so, you're supposed to tell your story, so I'm talking about how I'm a humanist, a secular humanist, and why I care about this issue. And the feedback I got from a and this was a retired legislator here in Minnesota who was also active in this issue, but was giving me feedback. And he said, well, you would have been more convincing if you had told me you were a Catholic. And it just speaks to our lack of power, and that our legislators don't take the nuns, the non-affiliated voters seriously yet. And again, why I think we really need to step up to speaking about what we believe and what we care about and our values.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Many years ago, I worked for the Reformed Jewish Movement, their social justice office in DC. And what I saw from even, more moderate and centrist faith denominations was that if you were a person of faith, right, you were sort of valued by a lot of them, even if you were from a different faith. But if you had no faith, not so much.
Right.
And so one of the things that we at Americans United do is we try to make sure that we are deploying faith leaders to advocate for the non-religious and non-believers as well. And I think that contrast is really important. I similarly think that non-believers and the non-religious need to advocate for people of faith.
Right.
I think that's as important because there's a lot of understandable, hurt feelings, to put it mildly. That's one way to put it, from some people who've become non-religious across the course of their lifetime from being hurt sometimes, by their faith. And so, but I think that we can blunt that argument that the non-religious community is anti-religion if we remember that we include all of us, whatever faith we come from or non-faith, we are all including that in our rhetoric that religious freedom protects all of us.
Exactly.
So long as we don't harm others.
Right.
And I wanted to actually ask Representative Agbaje, who's in the state legislature, sort of about this, because we've been talking about the role of faith voices, and I can imagine especially when you happen to be Christian, and that's effective, right? So we're all in certain ways part of majorities, in certain ways part of minority, all of us, right? We're multifaceted, and the ways that we're part of majorities can be powerful. We can sort of speak from those platforms powerfully. So I have noticed as a Jewish leader for the first time of a group that fights for religious freedom that it is useful to surround myself with Christians, other faith leaders, and the non-religious all together. For you, you're a government representative, right? So that's a difference. You're not in the advocacy community you're a government official and you advocate from that platform. So how do you think about bringing your faith and sort of your constituents?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So I am an Episcopalian, so cradle to grave. My father is an Episcopal priest as well, so I've been steeped in that. But to me, my faith has dictated kind of how I view the world and like kind of my role in it in terms of, when you have more, you help people with it. All of the teachings about like taking in the stranger and feeding the poor and working with the homeless, like all of that type of stuff has just been around in my upbringing. And that's part of the reason why I was drawn to social justice issues, because that is the type of work that if you read the Bible, that's the type of stuff Jesus was doing. And so for me, I try to emulate that in all facets of my life. Now, as a government official, I think it's really hard as a Christian to hear people who are Christian nationalists kind of deface Christianity. To me, when I hear them talk about how, well, my Christian faith prevents me from doing X, or my Christian faith says I have to exclude you, or my Christian faith says that you are somehow less than, that is what bothers me more than anything, because I know that our teachings say that we are meant to be inclusive. Jesus spent time with the people who were the social outcasts of his time. And so that is what we are called to do. And so for me, I find that the hardest thing to kind of listen to and hear about for people who are sort of using Christianity as a tool to do harm and negative things to a wide swath of people. And so that's something I think that is coming up a lot in a lot of government bodies. There's actually a representative from Texas. He too is also like a evangelical Christian, but the way he goes toe to toe with the Christian nationalists is just amazing to watch, because he's really talking about our role as elected government officials, as people who are in charge of ensuring that we are creating a better world for the people that we serve. Your faith can inform that. And even, and I think that's all faiths, and I appreciate my colleagues who do come from different faith backgrounds, because I think we all sort of enrich each other. And then the same with folks who are non-religious, like you were saying, like we all sort of uplift each other, because we're coming from the perspective of how do we help more people live thriving lives where they have the opportunity to care for themselves and care for their families. So that's how I use my faith in the work that I do. And I hope more people will, but I do think it kind of behooves us then as Christians to kind of call out people who are not acting in the name of Christianity, though they may say so.
Yeah, no, thanks. And I really struggle with this. I was part of a group fighting white Christian nationalism that was composed of mostly Christian leaders. And what I was struggling with, and this was not government officials, but what I was struggling with was the way that the way they were really fighting back was, of course, doing what you were just saying, which is mentioning this isn't our Christianity and this isn't what Jesus would do. And I think there's a really powerful message in that for Christians. And I was thinking about it sitting there as a Jewish person though, and thinking, but if Christians are arguing that what's wrong with this Christian nationalist policy is it's not really the right version of Christianity, that makes me feel left out, to be honest, because it's like, well, but what if the right thing right now is to go with sort of American values instead of Christian values, but it's the right set of Christian values, and it's really complicated. And I was thinking, when Christian leaders are talking to Christians in a church, by far the most compelling message is a Christian values message, for sure, and it should be. Just like when I'm in synagogue, and I hear, sort of about my Jewish values, and really it resonates. As Jews, we blah blah blah. Yeah, that's but I think it gets so much more complex in the government space because, especially today, where it is probably politically most effective to fight back with a message as a Christian. And also we can't divorce our religious identities from who we are as people. No one's asking us to do that, right? And at the same time, how do we enable everyone to feel included? I was wondering, that's why I think I was asking, you both, and Audrey, I heard you speaking a little bit about sort of the humanist perspective. And I was wondering, do you, and this sort of goes to a broader question for you three, which is really about working across divides and working with communities who are not in your own. And I mean, obviously it's a big politics question, but I mean, for real, like I'm wondering, I guess what this question is, I'm not seeing the 5 minutes yet. Oh, it just saw 5 minutes. Okay, I'm good. I guess what I'm wondering about this question is, so here we have champions for personal autonomy and freedom and bodily autonomy, right? Some of the really, really, I think, leader ones. And how much are you reaching across divides and kind of looking to bridge divides in your advocacy? How much is that possible even? What's happening with that right now?
Well, I think we all need to do more work on that. But what I want to say is, I think we have to connect the dots between all of us, religious and non-religious, around our values. And it's not so much, it has to be a religious divide, but I do think that we have to acknowledge there's a values divide in this country. And so I think everyone in this room and all the advocates here and all the advocates that are downstairs during the reception, that you can talk to a whole group of people we see as our allies, and I think we see each other as allies, is that we are joining together on common values. And I think those shared values are, respect for the dignity and worth of every person, working for the common good, working for that all could flourish with their authentic selves. And I think everyone comes at it for different reasons, their religious faith behind that, or their humanist values. And so different things may motivate us, but I think we have to come together saying, we're people that share these values. And because there are religious groups on the other side that have a different set of values, quite frankly. And so it's just really important, I think, is to focus on the values as opposed to necessarily you're of this religion.
Are you doing that? Is that happening?
I think we're trying to, and I think a lot of the advocacy groups do that, and they do reach out to the faith community, and the secular community, I think I think we're a little slower. We have not been very organized, and but we're starting, and HumanistsMN is really trying to step in up in the last couple of years. But humanism across the country is trying to do it as well.
That's great, Jess.
I mean, I don't do like community organizing. I do try to make what we do accessible. So if you hear me, I don't use a lot of I try not to use a lot of legalese. I try to just speak in normal, the way non-lawyers, normal human beings who aren't lawyers speak. And then I'll talk about our issues. I don't only talk to, I'm not going to just call out Front Minnesota and be like, don't you hate transphobia? And they're be like, of course we hate trans. I think people might be under that impression, but we talk about trans inclusion in sport on the local Fox affiliate, KTSP, NPR, we go in local media and talk about these issues. The way we do our litigation, because I'm only speaking for the legal team, is we do what's called impact litigation, which is where you're trying to actually move the law further. You can't just do impact litigation in court, because then you're going to lose. When I used to be a public defender, and if the Star Tribune's running articles about catalytic converter thefts in Minneapolis, what case do you think I do not want that morning in front of a judge, right? And it's the same thing with LGBT rights. It's the same thing with abortion, right? You have to really be cognizant of the fact that judges are human beings. They read the newspaper, and I think they probably read it more than other people because they're looking to see if they're in it, right? But I mean, it's true, right? If a judge grants someone bail and then that person goes and kills someone, that's a judge's worst nightmare. I still think the judge should be granting people bail. I don't think that's what they should be basing it on. Am I going to be in the news? But they do. They do read the news. They do look for stories about themselves, and they do look for, whether they want to or not, they're going to read stories related to the cases we bring. And so we also do education in the media. We also, I do talk to, people make a lot of assumptions about me. In addition to the fact that I'm Jewish, I grew up super Orthodox. I was taught creationism. I didn't know that the world was billions of years old until I was in my 30s, for real. And so my family is Trumpers, and I talk to them about trans inclusion in sport, because it's it's not pleasant, but I'm what's compelling to them? What points can I make where they're that's interesting. And I learn how to do advocacy by talking to people that I know disagree. And so I do that all the time, but I'm not going to go try to convince someone who doesn't believe in my fundamental humanity that I'm a human being, because I find that degrading and unpleasant, and I have other things. It's not I'm looking for things to do. So it's to what degree do I do that? To what degree do I prioritize that? But we do try to make all of our work accessible. I do try to speak not in legalese when I talk about our cases, and we do try to do as much education as possible. So, yeah.
No, I think I'm good. Well, I think we're probably at the 5-minute.
So I've insulted her.
Yes. Ashley is walking around. I want to thank Ashley, who works at Americans United, who's the events manager, for helping organize this with Audrey and Ellie and Suzanne and Marcy and everybody else. She's walking around collecting questions right now, so we're going to have a nice, healthy Q&A, and I'll go up to the podium. We can bring the other panelists. And we can bring the other panelists up, because the questions are for everyone. Okay, so the first question that Ashley gave me is, what is the connection between the school voucher movement and white Christian nationalism? Does anyone, let's see, how about Kirsten?
Everybody collectively looked at me, so I have a funny feeling that I was supposed to take this question. I mean, the first thing that I'll say is money, right? That's not a surprise to any of us here in this room. At the core of it, both of these movements are trying to undermine and erode public education, right? They want public dollars to go to private religious institutions. And so at the end of the day, we see them uniting on a whole lot of this on purpose. And I think that if we have dysfunctional school boards, if we have low test scores and things that they can point at and say, look, our public education systems aren't working, your tax dollars are being wasted, then that furthers the argument for school vouchers and school choice. And so they all are kind of running in the same circles, doing the same arguments on purpose.
Yep. And I'll just add a few things. One I said last night, which is that the private school voucher movement actually was born out of resistance to Brown versus Board of Education. There's a great book called Overturning Brown, which documents that history, but it was an effort to intentionally scrub the language of the movement of any reference of race. It's the school choice movement, right? It was completely intentional, but to divert money away from the public schools to primarily white Christian segregation academies for parents that were pulling their kids out of the public schools once they were desegregated. Also, Christopher Rufo, who's the founder of the anti-critical race theory movement, and in schools, he has said that the effort is to scare people about public education and critical race theory in order to deflect money out of the public schools to private religious schools. Like, that is the end goal. So you can see the white Christian nationalist element as well of the private school voucher movement. The other thing is that private religious schools are primarily white. They're less, although it's true that public schools themselves could be more diverse, the private religious schools tend to be even less diverse, and also, generally speaking, the studies have shown they help kids whose families already have pretty much enough money to send their kids to private schools, and not the kids who don't. So they don't primarily help the poorer folks among us. And 94% of Black families send their kids to public schools. 94%, 90% of the general population do. So pulling funds from public schools is disproportionately also hurting Black and brown families. Is there next question? Does anyone else want to add anything? Okay, I think we got that one covered. Okay. Okay, the Reproductive Freedom Act. Do you see that being threatened in Minnesota? Representative Agbaje.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that we put up is technically at risk and under threat. We will be doing our best to protect what we passed and put into law the past 2 years. But I do think that kind of around the country, reproductive freedoms are really coming under attack. And so I am grateful that here in Minnesota we stood up and we did something about it, but it's not foolproof. What makes it foolproof is all of you guys continuing to champion those efforts and champion the laws that we did pass and say that you don't want those changes. But I do think that kind of what we've been talking about with the separation of church and state, the folks who do want to come in and merge church and state, I think that is one way that they are going to continue to try to do that. So we all just have to be vigilant.
And I have a follow-up question, this one that says, legal support was discussed for the providers of abortion, which is great. What about women who get an abortion in Minnesota and go back to Texas and are charged legally? Any help there?
So our law wouldn't help you if you were charged in Texas. So this was always a conversation about how far these laws went. So like if you did something outside of Texas and then Texas wanted to charge you under Texas law, our law wouldn't really help with that. They couldn't get records from us to support their lawsuit, but you wouldn't be, because all of that was happening in Texas under Texas law, that wouldn't happen. But if it was the other way around, as I talked about, that's where you could probably find support. But just generally writ large, I mean, a number of organizations are doing either legal defense or abortion funds for people seeking abortion care around the country. And so I think that is a great place to put a lot of your efforts too. If you're more interested in financial support, I think those types of organizations would really love to help.
And there are like reproductive freedom defense funds. Like there are organizations devoted to providing legal counsel. The thing is, like it's perfectly legal to come to Minnesota and have an abortion in Minnesota and then go home to Texas. Like that's perfectly legal right now, at least for now. That could change. So that's not yet illegal. And one of the things we see, like with the chaos agents, right, like the Trump administration, is people don't know what their rights are, and then they preemptively comply. Like they think like, oh, I don't have the right to an abortion, and then they don't get one, and it's like right now it is completely legal to leave Texas, come to Minnesota. It's like, if you think of it like before the Republicans accidentally legalized weed in Minnesota, right? Like if Esther's like, I want to go do a bunch of weed in Colorado, like she can leave Minnesota, go to Colorado, do a bunch of weed and come back. That's not a crime because it's legal there. Say, like gambling, like if I go to Vegas and gamble, it's legal in Vegas to gamble. There are efforts right now to make laws that reach out of the states, right? To especially for minors, that's where we see a lot of these things starting. So there are efforts in some states to limit the ability of minors to travel for an abortion, and we're going to see that more. There's also federal law. So I'll be a little lawyery here. The U.S. Constitution has this thing called the Supremacy Clause, which means that federal law trumps state law and state constitutions. There are things that could happen at the federal level that we won't be able to do much about. You can always try to litigate, or the court's not super friendly. So yeah, it's not great. There are really terrible things that could happen at the federal level that our state protections may not protect us from, but I think this is what Esther was saying too, like don't preemptively comply. Like, like that's the key, is like, don't think you don't have rights when you do, because what's the difference between like you're not getting an abortion because you think you can't, and you're not getting an abortion because you can? It's either way, you're not getting the abortion. So it doesn't make a practical difference. So don't over comply is what I'd say.
Okay, great. This card has many questions, so I'll start with the first. How can we connect to and support the Secular Government Caucus, Representative Freiberg?
Yeah, if you hear of an issue you think we can be involved with, please reach out to me or any of the co-chairs, Representative Hollins, Senator Marty, Senator McEwen from Duluth. Contact I'm in the process of organizing it for this coming session. Shortly, we should have the list of all the members who belong to it out there. If you happen to see your representative or senator not on the list, please reach out to them and encourage them to join. So yeah, it's just let us know you support our work. Publicize it on social media. Just anything you can do.
So
I just want to.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I want to just reiterate what. This is really short. Anyway, or it's not long enough. Oh, there we go. All right. So I just want to reiterate what Representative Freiberg just said. Those of you in this room, everyone should reach out to your legislator and ask them if we'll find out, and we can find out from. Well, you can ask us in HumanistsMN, but thank your legislator for being a part. And last year we had about 24, and Esther's on it as well. A lot of, I think they're all Democrats though, right? That's sad but true. So anybody who has a Republican representative, tell them they should be. This is everybody. Should be a member of the Secular Government Caucus. As a former civics teacher, it is ironic that you should have to have a Secular Government Caucus. It's just ridiculous, but that's what it is. But we did take the idea from the national because this is an issue.
I was going to actually ask Representative Freiberg, what actually happens? Like, let's say someone leaves here and they're feeling very motivated. Everyone pledges to themselves they're going to take at least 2 actions. And one of them is they want to reach out to their member and thank them for being part of the Secular Government Caucus. Do you see that? Talk to us about how that works in offices. And also Representative Agbaje, you can talk about this too. I mean, I think a lot of people feel pretty disconnected from civic engagement and just feel like it just floats into the ether. So what reaches you?
Well, just speaking for myself, email is probably the best. I get letters as well. I mean, legislators are like any profession or group of people. Some of us are good at things, some of us are not so good at things. So you may have a legislator who's not the most responsive, but I think most of us try to be. That's certainly what we're elected to do, with certainly to our benefit to perceived as and to actually be responsive to our constituents. So I have gotten emails occasionally thanking me for being a part of the Secular Government Caucus. I read them. I try to respond to all the emails I get. I'm trying to be, and honestly, if you reach out to us, speaking for the House members, considering what we have going on right now, it'd be really nice if you just told us we're doing a good job. And you support our efforts you support our efforts to maintain democracy, to ensure that the will of the voters is implemented in Minnesota, because there are right-wing organizations, partisan organizations that are, even in pretty, I think Representative Badge and myself come from districts that are perceived as pretty safe for Democrats, but I've been hearing a lot from, certainly more from people who are motivated by partisan organizations to be very critical of us. But I have also received emails from people, one of them, Kyla, is in this room somewhere, just saying thank you for doing that, thank you for standing up for democracy. So it's, I know intuitively, I think that generally what we're doing is supported by a majority of my constituents, but it is nice to actually hear that from time to time.
Yeah, I would agree. Emails tend to be best. I will say I'm one of the members who is a little less on top of her email than others, but I do my best to respond to folks. And then, we do try to be active in our districts and active in the public. And so when you see us, feel free to come up to us. Feel free to come to our events too. We tend to host different town halls. That's actually a really great opportunity for me to engage with people, because I do like talking to folks face to face. And so those are the types of things I think that you can get engaged in a variety of ways. And I also think it helps to find an organization or to be a part of a neighborhood group that can help, amplify your voice as well to your representatives. And yeah, I will just continue to concur with Representative Freiberg. Right now in the House, a lot is going on, but a lot of it really is just coming down to what does it look like to try to overturn an election? And I think that's unfortunately what we're seeing in Minnesota. And so really, if you believe in democracy and if you want to stand up for your rights and the rights of your neighbors, this is the time actually really to get involved and make your voice heard, that you will not stand for this illegal power grab. So
Excellent. And I do think we underestimate the power of the thank you. And I think that's a really important takeaway. I'm going to read these, kind of go together. What organizations are doing good regarding religious freedom, countering Christian nationalism, and what websites, books, podcasters, etc. Who is Religious Freedom's version of Heather Cox Richardson? You want to take that one, Angela?
Yeah. Let me loop around here. I've got way too many resources, but I have a Substack, and twice a month I run a column called News with Nuance that has had a Christian nationalism focus and often has sort of a roundup of all the biggest news coming out regarding Christian nationalism and people that are fighting back. So I'm tweaking that a bit to focus a bit more on looking specifically at the radicalization happening among white men and boys and how that's dovetailing with Christian nationalist movements, especially in the wake of the Trump administration. Our own Minnesota's Pete Hegseth, a good example of that. So lots happening there. Podcasts. I think this group had Brad Onishi. He has the podcast Straight White American Jesus. I've been on there a few times. There's an episode where we talk about the TV show Fargo and how it talks about Christian nationalism, specifically in the upper Midwest in Minnesota. So you may want to check that one out. Kristen Dumais, the author of Jesus and John Wayne. And then I will say finally, maybe my top recommendation and where I get a lot of my news as well is from Word and Way, which Brian Kaler, who runs Word and Way, is on the board at Americans United. Is that right, Rachel? Mm-hmm. He's the vice chair. So Brian and I have worked a lot. Word and Way is also a Substack, but it originated as a Baptist magazine in Missouri, I think more than 100 years ago. So Brian represents progressive Baptists, and he loves to tell the stories of going to the Missouri legislature and it being, on one side a lot of people pushing white Christian nationalism, and on the other side he likes to say jokingly that it's him and the Wiccans. And he, thinks it's very important to have that present. So I recommend Word and Way. And then if you jump on my Substack, you'll see a huge list of books, newsletters, independent media. And I do try to cover this often in my Star Tribune columns as well. Sneak it past them.
Just want to add that, yes, we had Brad Onishi here last year to speak, and at the Humanist table downstairs, there's a lot of tables to check out, but we have a few of Brad Onishi's book down there if you wanted to get that. We also had from Americans United, Andrew Seidel speak to our group maybe about a year and a little over, a year ago. He was also in town. I don't know, we don't have any of his books yet, but he's for those of you who want more history and a little more legal background, he's written a couple of really great books, and maybe you have them at the tip of your tongue and I don't, but anyway.
I just have I have like 4 or 5 copies of my first book, Red State Christians, here, if anyone is interested in those.
Excellent.
So
Great.
I'll be downstairs.
Yeah, and I was going to just say, after you join Angela's Substack, you should join Americans United for separation of church and state. So we really are the only non-faith national group that works 24/7 to protect church-state separation and religious freedom. We have a magazine that you get every month in hard copy. We have some downstairs. I write a personal column in it every month, but it really is filled with information, and we'll plug you into what's happening as well with all these folks really on the ground. Jess.
And if you want opportunities to push for bodily autonomy and that sort of thing in Minnesota, you can follow Gender Justice Action. We often send out emails like, hey, this bill is going on. You can write to your senator. I used to never write to my senator or representative. I thought they didn't really read them. And then I learned sometimes they'll get about a bill 3 emails. And I'm like, oh, I could be I could be a quarter of the emails they get about a bill. That's pretty cool. So we do now. So if you sign up for the Gender Justice Action listserv, or if you go to genderjustice.us, you can follow our lawsuits. Unrestrict Minnesota is another one. They do bodily autonomy, a lot focused on reproductive freedom. So
Excellent.
And they can visit your table downstairs.
Oh yeah, and we have a table downstairs. Grace just gave a thumbs up, so come to our table.
And I just I want to confirm, are we ending at 4:30? Because I do want to save time. So around 4:25, or maybe even a few minutes before that, I'm going to ask every panelist to sort of conclude by saying what's an action or something that you suggest that people can do to fight back. So just be thinking about that. This is a school board's question, and this one is, I don't have kids in school anymore. Does the school board really care what I think? And how do we support school boards doing it right? What role can we play in supporting your organization? Kirsten, that's not just in addition to money is what it says. Yeah.
In addition to yes. The thing that I would say is that yes, your voice does matter. And let me be clear, a lot of the folks that show up on the other side and read weird snippets from books that they found online, yeah, right? The most salacious parts of things that they didn't know that book was even in the library until they heard about it on Fox News, right? Those folks, a lot of the times, also don't have children in the district, right? If you are a taxpayer in the district, you can and should come to your school board meetings, right? You should be paying attention. A lot of them are live streamed online, so you don't even need to leave your house. You can see what's happening. School Board Integrity Project, we're actually working right now to try to have kind of a research team, a whistleblower team, if you will, so that we can be a little bit more proactive. So if you want to be one of the folks that are watching those live streams or paying attention to what's happening, that would be really, really helpful for us. Because so often we don't know about things until it's at an extreme flashpoint, right? And we really have to combat it toe to toe because we're debating a book ban policy tomorrow in Osseo or something extreme like that. And so that would be the first thing that I would say. Obviously, if you have students in the district, that may weigh a little bit different for those elected officials, but they're your elected officials, just like your state representatives up here. So make sure that you're holding them to that same account. It's really important. And I think the other thing that I would say say is just talk about school board elections. Like I said before, so often people just don't know what's happening. In Minnesota, the vast majority of our school board elections are actually in off-year elections. This year in 2025 in Okehennepin, some of the biggest districts are on the ballot, and it's going to be one of the only things on the ballot in those districts. And so even when you think your voice might not matter, I can tell you we lost 2 school board seats, one in Okehennepin and one in Hastings, by less than 20 votes. So like it is that close, and especially when we know that we're on the right side of these, and I can tell you things like book bans, anti-LGBTQ policies, reasons to restrict the freedoms to learn and read as their authentic selves in school. I know that those are not popular. We're on the right side because the other side is hiding it, right? They're hiding in plain sight. They're not saying, hi, I'm running and I want to ban books, right? Like sometimes they do, and that's a different thing. But the reality is that they're hiding those conversations on purpose. It all looks very benign. We're talking about parents' rights and things that, just seem really, common sense. But the reality is that there's an insidious undercurrent. And so making sure that you're paying attention to that and that you're willing to call it out is really important, because they're winning because they have an outsized voice. And we just need to remember that we and the folks that share our values do have the majority in these conversations.
Okay, and so that insidious undercurrent. So here's a question. What motivates the average white Christian nationalist more, their whiteness or their Christianity?
I'll take that one. How long do you got? I think the trick answer to that is, for folks that are tied up in this movement, those two things are inseparable. That whiteness is deeply tied to their Christian beliefs. So much so that, when I first began speaking to groups, and primarily in conservative church settings, about the 2016 election, about Trumpism and Christian nationalism, I would say, we have to remember Jesus was not American. And people would look at me like, oh yeah, I guess he wasn't. But what was a moment for me of transition, living just a few miles from where George Floyd was murdered, and in the unfortunate, again, need for white Christians to hold up a mirror to our own complicity in America's history of racism, it became more important to me, and I write about this in the new book, to say that not only is Jesus not American, but Jesus is not white. And for white Christian nationalists, Jesus has to be white. That's why you see such a fight to hold on to this imagery of Jesus as white. That's why you see so much imagery now of the Crusades. I'm going to mention Pete Hegseth again. He has Crusader tattoos. And when I have folks complaining about my own anti-Christian nationalist witness, especially in the ramp up to the election, and I don't know if our legislators got this kind of stuff as well, a lot of the negative sort of online harassment I was getting was from folks with Crusader imagery. It was really interesting to see this lead up. So what's old is new again. And I would say that you can't really say which one motivates more, because for them, their Christianity has been usurped by this religion of whiteness. And Jesus has become more white than he has become biblical. And it's a really hard thing to move back from, because it's so central to the experience of American Christianity. And that's why the task is so hard.
So these two questions, I think, are related. This says at the top, Rev. Danker and Representative Agbaje, how do Christians reclaim Christianity while maintaining the separation of church and state? So that's one. And then the other is, I think, related. It says, for the panelists, maybe Angela, a fear I hear from Christian nationalists is a lack of shared cultural values due to the decrease in Christian adherence nationwide. So what sort of message would you share with these individuals? And I think that one's about, what are the positive values that we're pushing here if they're not Christian, and how do we rejoin that fear from Christians? So the first question was, how do Christians reclaim Christianity while maintaining the separation of church and state? And then how do we address that fear of what are our shared cultural values if they're not Christian?
I'll try. No, I mean, those are really hard questions to grapple with. As a what do they call them? Like the mainline churches, right? I think all of us are sort of grappling with our role in the world, as well as how do we kind of bring people back to church as well. The Episcopal churches, I know they're kind of going through it a little bit on kind of those issues, but they have decided to be more vocal on kind of social justice, kind of leaning political left on kind of those things. But I think in terms of reclaiming Christianity, one of the things that I try to think about a lot is that what it means to be a Christian is actually kind of following the teachings. And so sometimes what I see, and maybe the good Reverend can correct me in her research, but sometimes what I see from Christian nationals is that they kind of twist the Bible, they twist the teachings to kind of meet this political specific white agenda that they have. Whereas I think for the rest of us, we're trying to figure out, okay, how far can we go into the political space without encroaching on it? And so I think there's something that the leftist Christians, for lack of a better term, have to think about is how can we still use our voice to amplify our values, and that's what I liked what Audrey was saying, is that this is a difference in values, right? Because a lot of religions actually have similar values, and a lot of humanists have those same values of essentially being good to other people. So how do we amplify those values in a way that reflects the various faiths that we work with and our own faith, but kind of is focused on still being vocal in the world about our place in the world and the type of world we want to create without getting too much into this, we need to dominate the government per se. So it's probably not a great answer. It's something I'm still trying to figure out how to best articulate, but I do think it's something that, as Christians, I think if you're a progressive Christian or a leftist Christian, don't shy away from, if people ask you, don't shy away from your Christianity. I mean, we're taught that we're supposed to stand up, right? And so I think that's one thing to continue to remember, but also how do you show your faith, right? They'll know you more by your works and your actions and less so by just saying it over and over again.
And time for a short answer from you, and then we're going to go around the room.
Yes.
And we each have less than a minute for our wrap. Okay.
Okay. Well, I will be quick. What I think is helpful here actually is Lutheran theology. As a Lutheran, I have a very healthy perception of my own human depravity. And so this whole idea even that we could reclaim Christianity as deeply flawed human beings is a non-starter. And so I think that there is space for especially mainline traditions of really acknowledging, removing that log from our own eyes before we take the speck from someone else's. And I think what a lot of Americans want to see from Christianity is an acknowledgement of the wrongs that have been done in Christianity's names. So that's what I would advocate for. And, this sense of that we need to lean to death before we can have any kind of resurrection. And so really this deep honesty about our own complicity before we can cast blame on others for Christian nationalism. White mainline Christians have to name our own role.
Thanks. Grappling with hard questions. And I'm so sorry, we have so many more good ones. We just don't have time, so corner us downstairs. But first, let's conclude, and if it's okay, Audrey, we'll start with you, by just flying around. What's sort of one way that people can fight back?
Well, in HumanistsMN, we have our action emails, and they're downstairs at our table. Christine and Marcy and maybe some others will be down there. You could sign up. But also coming up, just on February 1st, we have something, HumanistsMN has pretty close ties to First Unitarian Society, and we rent space here. But the first Saturday of every month, we call it Secular Saturday. And so February 1st is a Saturday, the first Saturday, and so one of the things that's going to be happening in this building will be a workshop on advocating for secular humanist values. It's how to get going with lobbying and your legislators, and we'll be talking about some specific bills and things that we hope will happen yet this session. But I would just want to also say, so we hope people will get involved if you resonate with humanist values to join our group, and because we're activists, we do community service, we put our humanism, or we try to put it into action. But whatever group resonates with you here, get involved. That is the most important thing, is to get involved and let your voice be heard. Again, what I want to say is around these shared values that we have, these shared values.
Thanks. Thank you.
What I see to be maybe the top threat to our democracy is billionaire ownership of media. We certainly saw that in the election. And so what I would advocate for is finding a local, maybe independent media organization to support, and maybe even consider, if you're a New York Times subscriber, if you're a Washington Post subscriber. I love those organizations. I love the journalists there, but actually I don't love those organizations anymore. There's been a lot of problems. So I would really advocate considering moving your money to support independent journalism that's grounded in fact. There's lots of folks working on Substack. Right here in Minnesota, we have the Minnesota Reformer. We have the Sahan Journal. We got the Star Tribune. So that would be my top suggestion, because information needs to be out there to combat all of the propaganda flying around, and to hold some of that billionaire ownership to account at places like the Washington Post and the LA Times.
I would just say, like, be really vigilant for when people are trying to activate you, because that's one thing the white Christian nationalist movement is so good at, like, activating you. And when you're activated, it's why parents' rights is so effective, because what's scarier to a parent than, like, your kids are under threat, right? Like, that's, you're immediately activated. You go into fight and flight mode, you lose your critical thinking skills, and all of a sudden you're under the delusion that the biggest threat to women's sports is, like, a 5th grade trans girl, you know, like that's how it happens. And so just be really wary of people trying to activate you, and keep your critical thinking skills. Just stop and say, like, you know, it's like the Pizzagate, like someone's running into like a pizzeria with a rifle thinking that there's a sex trafficking ring, and then meanwhile there's like Jeffrey Epstein, like there are actual sex trafficking rings that like no one cares about. So like, yes, there's really big problems. There's like a lot of the problems being identified are real. That's how they are successful in activating you. But are they caused by the things that the white Christian nationalists are saying they're caused by? Like, usually not. So like, just maintain your critical thinking skills, I'd say.
Yeah, I would say pick one thing that's important to you, right? Like, we've been talking about a whole host of issues, and some of you might be feeling overwhelmed, but pick one thing that's important to you, figure out how to get involved, figure out how to engage with your local representatives at all levels of government, figure out how these organizations are engaging, and claim your corner of the world. But you don't have to do everything all at once.
Yeah, absolutely. My biggest thing is get involved in school board elections. Yeah, claps. Yeah. The reality is that we've lost these elections because we haven't been paying attention. And like I said before, we absolutely are the majority. And so making sure that you're talking about school board elections, that you're paying attention to what's going on at your local school board is incredibly important. And a little bit of silver lining in a very difficult couple of election cycles. The reality too is that we've won in school board elections. Looking at my friend Chris Williams over there. We've won in these races. School Board Integrity Project has worked with almost 400 candidates, and we have an over 80% win rate. And we have thanks. And we have candidates in rural, incredible Trump country, and we have candidates in Minneapolis and Golden Valley and right here in our backyards. And so the reality is that we can win these races, and it's easier to win these races than fight school board members who are not on our side. And then, yeah, downstairs, we also have a table. So go see our friend Erin down there, sign up for updates. We'll alert you to when things are happening, and do what you can to support school board elections.
Just quickly, I mean, I've already told you to say nice things to legislators. Another thing you can do, I don't think people always think about, is you can go to the legislature and testify on bills. A lot of bills you only hear about, the only people who come to testify are lobbyists or something. It's very powerful when somebody just, because they care about the issue, they're not getting paid for it, just comes and speaks on it. So, keep track of what we're discussing there. If there's an issue there that's important to you, anyone could sign up to speak on any bill hearing that's being heard in the committee. So just one specific thing I think you could do.
And I'll just add, number one, remind people that the values that we have in common as Americans include religious freedom. and church-state separation. So those are some great shared values to remind people of. I'd also just say, invite people in to what we're doing. Don't forget the power of just issuing an invitation. And I just wanted to tell a story this morning, a little bit after I had that wonderful breakfast with our supporter, and then I worked a little in this cute cafe in a freezing cold, not freezing cold, fine, it's gonna be freezing cold Monday, but, and it felt freezing cold to me. And then I went to a yoga class after, just because I really like yoga. I actually teach yoga on the side, because it really is one of my saving graces for myself personally. And the woman next to me, young woman next to me, at the end, I had mentioned I was in from out of town, and in the end she said, what brings you to town? So for me, that's always a moment of decision. It's like, am I going to talk about church-state separation right away? How am I going to handle this? You know, so the first thing that I said, my lead in, which is very sincere, is I work for a religious freedom organization, and I'm here to celebrate Religious Freedom Day. Bet you didn't know it was Religious Freedom Day. And her response was, "Oh, wow. Do you know what's happening in like Oklahoma right now with the Bible teaching?" So I said to her, so I was like, okay. So I said to her, well, yeah, like this is the name of my organization and you should consider joining. And by the way, I'm going to be at this event this afternoon. No pressure, but in case you want to come. And where are you, Lily? Stand up. Yay, Lily came. There she is, living proof. And I have to say, you're wonderful, Lily. And so was my Uber driver in Tulsa, who had this conversation with me when Robbie Jones and I were in town to talk about white Christian nationalism. And I invited him to the event that evening because we got talking, and lo and behold, he showed up. I bought him a copy of Robbie's book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, which is about white Christian nationalism, really. So don't forget to issue invitations. Don't forget that we have the power of all of you and all of these wonderful, amazing people on our side. And please give them a round of applause. Don't give up. Keep hope alive. And a huge thank you to HumanistsMN. Well done. Thank you. Suzanne, do people go downstairs now? Or Ellie's here. Okay.
Let's give one more round of applause to Rachel and our fantastic panelists. And I would also like to specially thank Audrey Kingstrom, Suzanne Perry, and Marcy Woodruff, and all of our wonderful volunteers who helped make today happen. And thank you all. It's so heartening to see so many people for whom these issues are important. This is just really kind of boosts my energy and my spirit around these things. So please join us downstairs. Like you heard, there are tables for a lot of the groups that are represented up here, as well as other ally organizations. But there will also be food, beer, wine, other beverages, good company, good conversation. And again, if you are able to make a donation to help us cover the cost of today's event, that would be very appreciated. So we'll see you downstairs.